Masechet Baba Kama Daf Ayin Gimel. Yesterday we saw a machloket between Rav and Abaye about whether Edim Zomin become disqualified from the time that the Edim Mizimim come and on, or retroactively from the time that they gave the original testimony. So, for example, if some witnesses came and said, we saw this guy, he stole this ox, right, and they give this testimony on Sunday, and then there turns out there that they are Edim Zomamin on Thursday, right? Other witnesses come and say, no, they couldn't have seen that because they were with us. So, from what date do these Edim Zomin become disqualified? Is it just from Thursday on? That's what Ava says. It's a Kiddush, or we don't want to mess things up from retroactively. And so Ava says from Thursday on. Abaya, however, says, now we know that their original testimony was false, so therefore they were Risha'im already from Sunday, and anything from Sunday on will be disqualified. They were disqualified from then already. All right, that was the machloket between these two Amoraim, and now we're going to attempt to make a parallel to the following two Tanaim, Lema Ketana'eh. So let's see if this works. We're going to reject this argument. Hayu Shenaim Me'idin Oto Shegana, Vehen Me'idin Oto Shetabach, V'uzmu al Geneba, Edut Shebat La Miksata Bat La Kula. This is a braita that's very similar to our Mishnah, that there was a set of witnesses, two people, that testify about a certain man that he's a thief and he stole someone's ox. And the same two witnesses also testify that the thief slaughtered it. And then some edim, mizimim, right? The second set of witnesses say that these guys were with us on that day of the geneva, so they could not have seen the theft. Now, once we cancel out the testimony about the theft, so then once part of it is canceled, all of it is canceled, because if there's no proof that these two guys stole the animal, then there's makes no difference whether they slaughtered it or not. It could very well be that they did slaughter it, but slaughtering it is not a prohibition because maybe they own it. And so they would certainly not pay. So in this case, because they did testify that it was stolen and they became Edim Zomamin, they have to pay for what they would have caused this alleged thief to pay. And therefore they have to pay double. However, the second part of the testimony about slaughtering, even if it's true that they slaughtered it, that would by itself would be no payment, and that was canceled. Once there's no geneva, then the whole issue of tevicha makes no difference, and therefore we just erase that completely. Right? They were retroactively disqualified, or even if they weren't retroactively disqualified, the fact that they would never are proven to have stolen it means that they whether they slaughtered or not doesn't matter. So in that case, they only have to pay two. However, the same case as before, the same two witnesses testify that this thief stole it and also that they slaughtered it. And then the Edim Zoamim come and say, no, they could not have seen the slaughter because the time that they allege the slaughter was, they were with us somewhere else. So in that case, the first testimony about Geneva stands because that was never rejected. And so the thief has to pay double because that testimony is good. But the fact that they slaughtered it, that they became Edim Zoamim about, so the thieves tried to make him pay 3 more times the double. So therefore, the Edim Zomin have to pay 3 times the amount for an ox, 2 times the amount for a sheep. Okay, that's Tanakama. Amar Rabbi Yosef, continuing the same baraita. All that is true if it's 2 separate testimonies. Then it makes sense to say, well, if the first testimony is found to be Edim Zomin, then there was never a Geneva. But they have to pay for a Geneva. But if there was never a Geneva, they don't have to pay anything for the Tebicha. And it also makes sense that if they invalidate the Tebicha, then the testimony about the Geneva stands. So all that makes sense if it's 2 separate testimonies. We'll define exactly what that means. But if it's all one testimony, then once any part of it is canceled, is invalidated, then the whole thing is thrown out because it's all part of one testimony. So let's first define, what does this mean? What is the category of two testimonies and one testimony? How do you tell which one is which? If you think that two testimony means literally two different sets of witnesses, and so therefore one testimony means one set of witnesses who come first about the theft, and then sometime later, an hour later, a day later, they testify about the slaughter. So if that's what it means, and then in that case, if you say that this is what these words mean, then it wouldn't really make sense according to for the Biose's ruling, because that means the Biose would be saying that when you have one testimony, which we just defined as one set of witnesses that testify separately, first about the Geneva, and then after some time about the slaughter. So when they testify about Geneva first, and then about the Tevicha after, and they become Edim Zomim regarding the slaughter, they were never there, they couldn't have seen that slaughter. So would you say that because part of it was canceled, the whole thing was canceled because they became Edim Zomim regarding the Tevicha, that they should also become Edim Zomim regarding the Geneva? That's what Rabbi Yosef said. Rabbi Yosef said, when it's katehat, then we throw the whole thing out, right? Remember his words here. You throw the whole thing out. But why? From where would you derive that from? What reason would you have to throw out the testimony about the Geneva just because the testimony about the Tevicha was found to be false? How does that affect the earlier testimony, which was on a separate occasion? So this would make no sense. When it says two testimonies, it means one testimony that's like two testimonies. What does that mean? It means all the cases are talking about one set of witnesses. That same set of witnesses are testifying about both things. So two witnesses, two testimonies, te'eduyot, means the same set of witnesses on two separate occasions. First they do about Geneva, and then sometime later about the Tebicha. But if it's one testimony, meaning on one occasion, right? They come to court, and at the same sitting, they testify about both the Geneva and the Tevicha. That is when we say, if they're found to be Edim Zoamin about one part of it, then we throw out the whole thing, right? Remember, the Geneva and the Tevicha, those happen on separate times, separate hours, separate days. So they saw the fact that they testified to those things, that they saw those things happen, they saw them whenever they happened, which was on different times. But they come to court and they tell us about it, they testify about it, all on one occasion in one sitting. Okay, so that's what the cases are talking about. Now, it must be therefore that Rabbi Yosef thinks v'sabruha dekula alma toch kedei dibur kedibur dameh, and everybody thinks, both Rabbi Yosef and Rabbanan, they think that if you say something within a short period, in other words, if you say statement A and then you just pause for less than the amount of time it would take to give a greeting to your rabbi. We'll see that in a second. Let's say it's 2 seconds. So if they continue speaking and don't break for more than 2 seconds, then we consider that all one statement. This is true in lots of areas of halacha, like in prayers. And so here they testify about the Geneva, and then they pause for 1 second. That's not called a pause. They continue into Tevicha. That's all considered one continuous statement. So let's assume that everybody agrees with that. Obviously, we're going to reject this soon. But right now, we're accepting it. So if we accept all these definitions and this principle, then Maila b'hakami palged Rabbanan sabre mikanul haba hu nifsal vekevan demeahi shata kamitazeme atebicha dekamitazeme itazum ageneba de la mitazeme la itazum. So it seems that they're arguing along the lines of Abaye, Ravan Abaye, such that Rava thinks that, like Rava did, that one of the witnesses are disqualified only from the time of Hazama and on. And since it's from that time and on, they become disqualified. So we're only going to throw out the tevicha. That's what the thing that they said second, so that they have to pay the 3. If the Edim Zomin come and say they couldn't have seen the tevicha, so the tevicha, we're going to throw out that testimony and they have to pay 3. But regarding the geneva, they did not become disqualified, though, because the witnesses didn't say anything about the geneva that they were with us at that time, and that's why the thief would have to pay 2. And the Edim Zomin would have to pay 3 in that case, right? Because we do not say that they were all disqualified retroactively, so it's only from the tevicha on, and the testimony about the geneva stands. Rabbi Yosef savar lemafreya hu nifsal v'kavan demiyad ki yasidu hu demipaseli itazemu lehu atevicha itazemu lehu nami ageneva taha toch kede dibur kedibur dameh. And it seems Rabbi Yosef would hold that they are disqualified retroactively, like Abaye said, and therefore they become disqualified from the moment that they start speaking, from that they start testifying. Therefore, if they become a Edim Zomin regarding the tevicha, even though they said that in the second half of their statement, they are going to be a Edim Zomin also for the geneva, because they said the whole thing in one statement. And so therefore, since they said the whole thing in one statement, once the second half of their statement becomes they become Edim Zomin, they are retroactively disqualified from the very beginning of their testimony, right, which was all said within one statement. And so that's the retroactive part of it, is just from the end of their statement to the beginning of the statement. And so you see here that Rabbi Yosef thinks that we disqualify them retroactively, like Abaye. So should we say that the machloket Amoraim parallels this machloket Tanaim, which is always difficult to say, because then Rava should just say, I hold like Rabbanan. Abaye could say, I hold like Rabbi Yosef. Why are they regurgitating a machloket that was already there? So we reject this parallel, and it's kind of obvious that we're rejecting it. It seems like this hypothesis is only here to set us up to bring in this topic of toch kede dibur. So amri toch kede dibur ke dibur dameh de kula amal mafrehu nifsal. No. If we accept the principle that speaking within a short time lapse of less than 2 seconds is considered a continuous speech, then if that were the case, if that were the true principle, then everybody would agree that once part of a statement is disqualified, the whole thing will be disqualified, because it's all part of one statement. And so if it was really all kotok de dibur, even Rabbanan would agree that if they become disqualified regarding the tevicha, then this is not retroactive. It's all one statement, right? You don't need to go back in time and say, oh, okay, since Monday. It's just that part of your statement was nullified, then the whole thing is nullified, and everybody would agree to that. So that's the reason for the Biyoseh, not because he follows Abaye and he says, oh, even though they became Dim Zimizimin on Monday, on Thursday, we're going to go back to Sunday and everything since then. That's a case where it's all separate things that they did on Monday and Tuesday, Wednesday, they become disqualified from then. But here, the Biyoseh's reasoning is simply because we consider it one statement. And therefore, you turn out to be liars if if you fill out a form and part of it is false, then we throw out the whole thing. Okay. Ela hacha betoch kede dibur kedibur dameh kam mipalge. Rabbanan sabre toch kede dibur lav kedibur dameh. V'Rabbi Yosef sabar toch kede dibur kedibur dameh. Rather, they're arguing about this very principle, nothing to do with Abaye and Rava, about retroactive. No, it's simply about whether if you say two statements, but they're separated by just 1 second, is that considered two separate statements, or is it considered one continuous statement? The Rabbanan think that it's not like one continuous statement, and therefore, even though they were there in one sitting and they said, we saw him steal it, and now they waited just a tiny bit, and then they said, we saw him slaughter it. Well, the Edim Zoamin came and said they couldn't have seen the slaughter, so that part is rejected, but the first part still stands, right? Because the rabbis will consider it two separate statements as long as they paused even a bit. Whereas Rabbi Yosef says that if they only pause for a very short time, then we consider it all one statement, and therefore if any part of the statement is nullified, the whole thing is nullified. Okay, so that's the answer. It really has nothing to do with the retroactivity. It's all about whether a pause is considered a break or not. So we just established that Rabbi Yosef thinks that we do a less than 2 second pause is like nothing. It's all continuous statement. This would mean that it has two consequences. One, if you say A and B, then A and B are all there together. It also will have a consequence if you change what you just said, right? Like if you say the wrong beracha, you said boreh pri ha'etz, and then you realized that you're actually eating a Danish. As long as you change it within less than 2 seconds of pause, right? You say, oh, boreh mine mezonot, and you say the right thing, so you can undo what you just said and substitute the second thing. So that's permitted. So that's the other way that it makes a difference. That as long as it's a very, very short pause, we consider it as if not a pause, but you're fixing what you had said. That would be a second consequence of what Rabbi Yosef said. So Rabbi Yosef would say, yeah, you can undo what you said, or it's a continuous statement. We put them all together. V'ha'tenan, we have a contradiction where Rabbi Yosef seems to say the opposite. There's a Mishnah Masechet Timurah. Harezo Timurat Ola, Timurat Shelamim. Harezo Timurat Ola, Dibre Rabbi Meir. Someone has an animal and he designates and he wants to make a Timurah. He has one animal that's consecrated. Now the law is, if you have a consecrated animal and you try to switch it, it doesn't work. Vayahu utmuratohi kodesh. The original is holy, and the second one that you try to substitute it for also becomes holy. So let's say you have an olah, you have a shelamim. These are holy animals, and now you go to a third animal that is not holy, and you say this animal is going to be a timurah for my korban olah. So if you would stop there, then this new animal will become itself a korban olah. The old one will still be also a korban olah. But then, as you're saying it, you change your mind and you say timurat shelamim, right? No, timurat shelamim. You say it very, very quickly, right, within 2 seconds. So what is the law? According to the Rabbi Meir, it remains a timurat olah. You can't change your mind. Once you make something a timurat, once you say timurat olah and the animal becomes an olah, you can't undo it and make it a shelamim, so it stays the same. Rabbi Yosef Omer, im lechach nitkaven metechila, hoil ve'efshar likrot sheteh shemot ke'achad, devarav kayamin. Rabbi Yosef says, we ask him, what did you mean by saying these two statements back to back? If he meant that he wants to make this third animal as a substitute, in fact, for both the korban olah and the korban shelamim, he wants to put two into one, but you just can't say, right? God can say two things in one utterance, but human beings can't say two things in one utterance. So since he can't say two things, that he just said it back to back, but he really means for both of them to apply, then his words, his statement stands, and it's not changed. How does the statement stand? How can it be olah and a shelamim? What we do is we take this animal that he tried to make a substitute, we let it pasture until it gets a blemish, and we sell it. with the funds, we use half of it for an olah and half of the funds for a shelamim. But if we ask him, v'imamad timurat olah, v'nimlach v'amad timurat shelamim, harezo timurat olah, if his intention was to make it fully a substitute of an olah, and then he changed his mind, and he says, no, you know what? I don't want it to be a timurah. I want it to be a timurah, a substitute for a shelamim. Well, you can't do that. You can't, once you make it an olah, you can't change it and undo that. So only the first label sticks, that's an olah, and the shelamim is meaningless. So that is the Mishnah. When we analyzed this Mishnah, we asked, Nimlach Pishita. The second case where he says, my intention was I wanted to change my mind. Obviously, you can't change your mind. Once you made it a timurah, an olah, it's going to be an olah. You can't undo that. So why would you have to even say that? The Papa says the Kiddush is that he said these statements back to back within a pause of only 1 second. And the Chidush is that, according to the Biyoseh, even though he only paused for such a short time, we might have said, oh no, it's okay. You could undo your statement because you fixed it right away, the 1 second rule. And therefore, it's as if you never said Timurat Olah and you only said Timurat Shelamim. You might have thought that Toch Kedei Dibur is like Dibur and it was one continuous statement, and therefore the second statement erases the first, and therefore he said that's why he has to give us the Chidusha to say, not so. If you say Timurat Olah Timurat Shelamim, even though you said it back to back, with just 1 second pause, nevertheless, we do not say that two statements, Toch Kedei Dibur, is like one continuous. You've finished, you put a period, that's it, an end. And Timurat Shelamim cannot change that. What do we see here? That we see, according to the Biyoseh, that a statement, Toch Kedei Dibur, is not considered a continuous statement that the second can undo the first. This contradicts what we said earlier. So we answer as follows, Amri, Tereh Toch Kedei Dibur Aveh. There are actually two different time periods that are both called Toch Kedei Dibur, and the Braita above and this Mishnah were assuming two different definitions. Chad kedei she'ela tamid l'rav, v'chad kedei she'ela tarav l'tamid. Ki let Rabbi Yoseh, kedei she'ela tamid l'rav, shalom alecha Rabbi umori, denafish. Kedei she'ela tarav l'tamid, shalom alecha itle. There's two definitions. One is how long it would take for a student to greet his teacher, and the other, how long it would take a teacher to greet the student. When it said that we said that Rabbi Yoseh does not think that it's considered one period. He was assuming the longer one, which is when a student greets a rabbi and he says, Shalom alecha Rabbi umori. That's 4 words. That will take over 2 seconds to say. And therefore, since that's a long time, we say, you said Timurat Olah. And then you think about Rabbi Mori, right, 2-3 seconds later. Then he said, no, I want to change my mind. Timurat Shelamim. So that's too long. Rabbi Yosef says, sorry, you finished your sentence. The second one is not a continuation and can undo the first one. But in the when I was talking about the Mishnah, where they testify and they say he stole it and he also slaughtered it. That was when they said the two parts of that testimony within the time it takes for a master to greet a student. A teacher only tells a student, Shalom Alecha. He doesn't have to add Rabbi Umori. He doesn't say Talmidi. He says a shorter version, Shalom Alecha, which is only 1.5 seconds. It's less than 2 seconds, however you want to estimate this. And therefore, if it's only the time it takes Shalom Alecha to be or less, then that is considered one statement. And that's the reason why, according to the Biyoseh, when they become Edim Zohamin regarding the Tevicha, then that undoes the whole thing, because they said it only within this 1 second time lapse, and therefore, since part of it was canceled, the whole thing is canceled. Whereas Rabbanan would say that no, as long as you have a Shalom Alecha, that even less than that, it breaks the time, and if there's any gap at all, they're considered two separate statements. And just because the second one was canceled doesn't say anything about the first, and therefore the first stands, and the thief would have to pay double, and the Dim Zohamin would have to pay only the 3. Now that we brought up one law about Edim Zohamin, Rava has another chidush about this topic. Amar Rava, Edim shehuchashu ulbasof huzmu neheragin, tehachasha techilat hazamahi, ela shelo nigmera. Let's say you have two witnesses that testified that a certain guy is a murderer and therefore is deserving of capital punishment. Then a second set of witnesses comes and says, no, we testify that defendant is not the murderer. So these are contradictory witnesses, right? So now we have 2 against 2. This is not Edim Zohamin. It's just, one says he is the murderer, one says he's not the murderer. Okay. Now, at this point, we're not going to kill that guy because it's contradictory testimony. All right. And then a third set of witnesses comes and says the first set of witnesses that said this guy's a murderer, they couldn't have even said anything because they were with us in Chicago at a ball game. They could not have possibly been there to testify. Now, the first set are Edim Zohamin. Rava's chidush is that those first set, they get capital punishment. Even though their testimony was already contradicted, nevertheless, even after a contradiction, you can still have Edim Zohamin. Why? Because the contradiction is just the beginning of the Hazama process. When you say that when Edim Mizimim come and say these witnesses could not have been there, could not have testified there, were in a different place, you're also saying that they're false, right? That the testimony is false. There's just an additional layer that they couldn't even possibly have been there at all. So the hachasha of the second set of witnesses is really just a preparation for the third set of witnesses that make them Edim Zohamin, right? It's just that the process has not yet been completed, and so they get capital punishment. Amar Rava, mina amina la. What's my proof? He has a proof from a Braita and a long discussion about this Braita. Titanya. מעידני באיש פלוני שסימא את עין עבדו והפיל את שינו, שהרי הרב אומר כן, ונמסו זוממין, משלמין דמי עין לעבד. We're going to analyze this Braita and see exactly what the case is, but basically, there's some slave owner owns a slave, Eved Kanaani, who goes free if either the owner knocks out his eye or his tooth, the slave will go free. So 2 witnesses come and say, we know that this slave master, first he blinded the eye of his slave, at which point the slave would then go free, and now he's a free man. And then this guy also knocked out his tooth. At that point, he'll have to pay for the tooth because now he's a free person. It's like anyone going and knocking out the tooth of a free person. Let's say, for example, that a tooth is worth $1,000, an eye is worth $10,000. So they're making based on their testimony, they're making this owner, number one, lose the value of his slave, and also that he's going to have to pay this former slave $1,000. Now, there we have a curious line that the master says so. This means that this testimony is good for the master. We're going to explain further what is good about the master about this, that the master would be happy about this testimony. Seemingly, he wouldn't be happy that he has to pay anything at all. Okay, now it turns out that set of witnesses are Edim Zohamin. Those witnesses have to pay the amount of an eye to the slave. This is curious. Why would he have to pay an eye to the slave? The eye was just there. What should happen is that the witnesses who were found Edim Zohamin should have to pay the value of the slave to the master, because then, based on testimony, the slave was going to go free. He would lose the master, and furthermore, they would have to pay the amount of the tooth also to the master, because the master would have had to pay the slave, or pay to the slave because the slave was going to receive that money, and now they're not receiving that money. But why would have to pay the amount of the eye? Because no one would have paid that amount anyway. So these are all important questions. What is the case? If we take it at face value, that there's only one set of Edim, one set of Edim that testified about this, and then there's Edim Zohamin after that, then Mishalamin Demei Ayin La'eved, why would the Edim Zohamin, once they're found to be Zohamin, have to pay the value of an eye to the slave? By knocking out his eye, since that was done first, that gives the slave his freedom. So why would he have to pay for the value of the eye if he got his freedom based on that? Why should there be any payment of the eye, and why should it go to the Ived? Furthermore, what it should say is that the Edim Mizomemin have to pay the amount of the slave to the master, who because of their accusation would have, if their testimony was ratified, they would have let the slave go, would have lost the slave. And also says, oh, the master would agree with that. Why would the master like this, be happy with this testimony? Does he want his slave to go free? Does he want to have to pay for the tooth? What does this mean? So this at face value makes no sense. Rather, there's multiple sets of witnesses, 3 altogether. The first set of witnesses come and say that the master knocked out his tooth and then his eye, which means after knocking out the tooth, the slave goes free. After knocking out the eye, then the master will have to pay the slave $10,000, the value of the eye. And now a second set of witnesses come, and they are edim machishim. They're contradictory witnesses, not zomin. And they say, Eno v'hadad shino. They say, no, everything you said happened, but it was in opposite order. First he knocked out his eye, and then his tooth. In that case, therefore, once the master knocks down his eye, he goes free for the eye. And only then his tooth. And so there, in this case, if they are ratified, then the master only has to pay for the amount of the tooth, $1,000, which is much less, because they have contradicted the testimony of the first guy. Now it makes sense. That's why it says, and the master would say so. The master would agree with me. The second set of witnesses say, because the master is happy about this news. In either case, he loses the slave, but beforehand he would have had to pay $10,000 for losing the eye. But now the second set of witnesses come and say, no, it was the tooth that happened second, so he only has to pay $1,000. This is, that's good news. Yeah, I would agree with that. And then the third set of witnesses would come, and they are the edim mizimin. They're the ones that say that the second set of witnesses, they could not have testified. They were with us in a different place. So because of that, they have to pay the second set of witnesses have to pay the amount of the eye to the slave, because based on their testimony, they would have if they had never come, then, and you only had the first set of witnesses, the master would have said, we assumed, he went free because of the teeth, and then the master would have paid the slave $10,000. When the second set of witnesses come, based on that testimony, the slave loses out $10,000. Actually, loses out $9,000, because even after the first witnesses came, the slave would have received $1,000 for his tooth. After the second set, he was about to get $10,000 instead. So the second set, after they're found to be false, they are making the slave lose out on $9,000. That's why they have to pay the slave $9,000. So that all makes sense. Now that we understand the case of the Baraita, Shema mina hachasha techilat hazamahi. Now we understand that hachasha, the contradiction of testimony, which in this case, the first two sets of witnesses contradict each other. Even though it doesn't matter what order, they still contradict each other. So the second set of testimony, the middle one, they are on the one hand contradicted by the first set of witnesses, and then they're found to be edim zoamin. Nevertheless, they still have to pay. So you see that we don't say that if there's already contradiction, then there's no such thing as edim zoamin. Even though it's contradicted, that's just the beginning of the process of finding them false. And now the edim zomin just come, that this the final nail in the coffin, that they are for sure false, and they were so brazen to testify about something, and they were not even in the country, and so they have to now pay. And that is Rav's proof. That's quite an elaborate proof. Amar Abaye Lo, Rabbi says, no, not a good proof. Why? Because he says, I can interpret that baraita differently. That does not include a case of three sets of witnesses where two sets of witnesses contradict each other, and then the third set are adim mizimin. I don't have to say that. I could say it's only talking about two sets of witnesses and still explain all the details. Da'afachinhu ve'azminhu. I'm just going to switch around the order that you said, and assume that the second set of witnesses that are contradictory are also the ones that said that the first set are edim zomemin. So in Abaye's reading, the first set of witnesses come and say that the master knocked out the eye and then knocked out the tooth, and therefore the slave goes free after the eye, and they have to pay $1,000 to the slave. Then the second set of witnesses says, number one, we saw what really happened. And it was the tooth first that got knocked out, and then the eye got knocked out, and therefore, see, you're going to have to pay $10,000. And furthermore, those first set of witnesses, they weren't even there at the time. They could not possibly have seen it. And therefore, they're totally wrong. They're totally false. That's the case that we're talking about. We see here that in reality, based on the second set of witnesses, since the tooth was out first, the slave went free, and then his eye, the slave was deserving of collecting $10,000. But because of the first set of witnesses that said, no, it was the eye and then tooth, so the slave would get only $1,000. So you see that because of that first set of witnesses who lied about the order, the slave would have lost out on $9,000. And that's why when the second set come and say, number one, you're wrong, it was the wrong order. Second of all, you're adim zomemin. So that's why that first set of witnesses has to pay the $9,000 to the slave. But you see here, there's no proof for Rava's rule, because here it's not once at one step. It was hachasha, and then they were found to be zomemin. The second set are doing both at the same time and just totally knocking out that first set. It's all part of one testimony that's saying the first ones are not only could they not have been there, but we also know better. And so therefore it's not a two-step process, and so there's no proof for Rava according to Abaye. Now Abaye says, and how do I know I'm right? Mimai midesefat b'mepach v'hazama resha nameh b'mepach v'hazama. The continuation of that very baraita also has a case where you have one set of witnesses and then another one comes, and in the sefa, the second set of witnesses switches around what the first set of witnesses, and they also are edim mizimin that say that the first set of witnesses couldn't have been there. So since in the sefa they switch them around, and so they're hachasha and edeh hazama all in one, so too in the resha there's only two sets, and they're hachasha and edeh hazama all in one. We will analyze the sefa of the baraita on the next stuff. Baruch Adonai le'olam. Amen ve'amen.